first I'd like to thank François and the University of Reims for inviting me along this afternoon to talk to you. I'm going to speak to you in English because I've been asked to speak to you in English, but I'm almost perfectly bilingual since I teach in French for the last 22 years. Okay, basically I'm just going to give you one piece of information right now. It's got nothing to do with this, but it's got something to do with what you said, and about Google. Okay, one of the best search engines I have ever used is, and it's funny, is called dogpile.com. It searches Google, Yahoo, Bing, and two others. And so you get an incredible range of information. Dogpile, dog. I like dogs. Okay, so it's called dogpile.com. And you'll see there's a caricature of a dog on the homepage. It's all of my students use it now because it's so effective and efficient. Okay. Now I decided I was going to show you a few caricatures at the end of the presentation if I had a couple of minutes. And then what was being talked about this morning, I decided to move them up to the front, even though these are basically show you this is not recent. This is a manual, one of the full manuals I did for community development 20 years ago. And in this case, all the caricatures, there's little text. A lot of the characters are were done by my daughter. Okay, there's a teacher, a French teacher, and an artist. And so we have this typical thing, and this is just community. But I could say the same thing at university level, departments, university, the institution, say at government, associations, all sorts of organizations that we come in contact with. We solve problems by striking committees and then don't talk to anybody else. I mean, I know that's an exaggeration, but it's so common, it's not funny. So we on the one hand, integrate a few people into a committee, and on the other hand, we exclude most of the people that probably should be there, should be discussing things. So that's one. Okay. Do we invite people to participate? One at a time? Association or organization at a time? Or is it open? At the local level, it should be open, and increasingly it is in some jurisdictions anyway, in some cultures. So again, we have in Quebec the tables de concertation, which have existed for about 25, almost 30 years now. And one of the major way of getting players to get together to talk about different issues. But one of the problems is once you've got people together, it has been very difficult to add new representation as we suddenly discover, hey, we should be talking to an environmental association too. But once you start with this sort of thing, it becomes very difficult for people to let somebody else in on the action. And it doesn't matter what level of government or what scale we're talking about. It's the same type of thing. And this is something that we've talked about. I just chose 3 caricatures out of about 20 my little Stephanie did for, where somebody at the top, and this is somebody, the government with money, provides also an action plan in the context of a program, and which is supposed to have involved the other players at the local or regional level in developing it. And frequently it's not the case. Okay, what I want to do is to based on about 20 years of research in the laboratory I run, on climate change, but it's also the continuation of about 45 years of research that I've done on urban fringe agriculture, metropolitan agriculture, urban agriculture, and the last 28 years on local and community development. And basically in the climate change literature and in the agricultural research that we do. All of those three things are pulled together very, very frequently. Okay, the argument that I'd like to make is that increasing capacity to adapt, and I include mitigation in that because mitigation also requires people to adapt. To climate change and variability, CCV, is required of all actors, as I said in the comment earlier on, including government. And this is absolutely essential if we're going to develop a governance system based on participatory democracy. And that is, in turn, essential for success. Because if we don't have participatory democracy, we end up excluding a whole chunk of the population's creativity and ability to take responsibility and leave it in the hands of a few who aren't any better position in terms of their knowledge than most citizens, I'd argue. Okay, we've had so much talk about climate change and adaptation for so many years. Really, overall, there hasn't been a great deal of progress. And when there has been progress made, frequently we don't even recognize it because it doesn't come in at the right level. It doesn't hit the right buttons with the right people at the right level in the hierarchy. And so I want to basically draw on the work that we've been doing, especially for the last 20 years. And then I just picked out a few. One just a few paragraphs on the Green Economy and Natural Resources Forum that had to do with the importance of local and citizen involvement. And the second one was probably much more important. It was a consulting report I did for the International Development Research Centre in Ottawa and the three main granting councils in Canada, engineering, natural science, health, and social sciences. And it basically involved me interviewing a bunch of researchers and ONGs, NGOs, I should say, sorry, NGOs in Canada, in South America, in a few in Europe, Africa, and Asia. And one of the things that we learned out of, well, there was a competition, international competition that was set up for that. We had 124 or 5 applications. We ended up choosing 12 out of 125, and they all involved research teams in Canada and research teams in various developing, or what we call lower and middle income countries, because they're not just countries in the south. Okay, and one of the things that was particularly interesting is that this whole initiative started out of a 2-day workshop in Ottawa in 2007. And we had people, researchers in the field of climate change and adaptation from across Canada, as well as people from other developing countries or lower middle-income countries, and representatives of the IDRC in different parts of the world. And the result of it basically was say, okay, yes, adaptation to climate change is important, but actually what's really more important in many cases is simply socio-economic development in terms of building capacity. So we just can't look at our climate change world in a box. Oh, and the other, well, that's one of our many reports that we did for the government, which they may have read, but I don't know whether they ever did. I was told by a leading climatologist in Canada that, oh yeah, a lot of people, when they talk about the government loves supporting climate change research, because they know when it comes from a climatologist mostly, it's going to be unintelligible, so they don't have to read it. They can put it on a shelf and simply tell people that they finance research in the area, and they don't have to do anything. And that's basically what's happened other than financing research up until maybe the last 3 years. This one is one of my colleagues in the planning faculty at the University of Montreal. And one of the things that he said is we actually converge a lot where he's talking about biodiversity in sub-Saharan agriculture, and he says basically there's virtually no progress that's been made over the last 20 years. And that's quite acceptable. I think it's just alarming. Okay, quickly. So once we accept, and not everybody's accepted still, that it's, climate change and variability is a real phenomenon with consequences, important consequences for human activities, adaptation becomes a major challenge, and it may actually be the major challenge for the future, and so followed by the adaptive capacity of the different actors, of different players. So for agriculture, which is one of the areas that I've spent most of my career doing research, the actors involved in agriculture include the farmers and the food producers. I put in food producers because a lot of urban agriculture, the way we think of it in North America, urban agriculture is still the agriculture that's within the agglomeration, whereas in Europe it's viewed much more broadly. The communities, the citizens, the citizen associations, non-residents, non-resident neighbours of farmers, environmental associations, and so on. So there are a whole bunch of actors, different players, that need to be involved. Just because you have an agricultural zone with farm production doesn't mean to say that the other people don't have a legitimate interest in what's happening there and in what's happening to farming from the point of view of climate change. Okay, so we have this multiplicity of actors. They all have legitimate interests in our object, which is agriculture and what is happening to it. It means that they need also to be involved in order to make any action effective. Okay. So we're not just, as well, we're not just talking at adaptive capacity at the level of the people like farmers who are actually managing a specific human activity, where our initial focus is, but it's also related to all the other people. And governments in particular, fortunately in some fields, but not so much in climate change, there are quite a number of national jurisdictions where the role of government has been actually changing over the last 10 to 12, 13 years. The way in which they do business with people. And I did a consulting report for Economic Development Canada on that, and hopefully they might change some of the ways of doing things. Okay. How do we ensure that governments increase their own capacity? I worked once with a program, it was a community development program, where for a government agency, ministry, where the aim was to build a community capacity, to take charge, to take responsibility, and so on. And we had a director in Quebec of that particular program who was absolutely excellent. And he had so excellent that he managed to put a team of 6 or 7 people together, young people together, who were also excellent. So it was superb working with these people and with all these communities around Quebec, mostly rural communities. And then unfortunately the director retired. 6 to 8 months later, everybody left in that team because he was replaced by an accountant. You know, I'm not sharing, I don't say, I know some good accountants. I hire one. But I mean, they don't necessarily automatically have a big degree of affinity with communities and agriculture and rural development and the rest of it. Okay, so what we've been doing, we did agriculture, we've done almost 20 years non-stop of looking at agriculture, adaptation of agriculture to climate change. We did 3 years on tourism activities, ski and golf, using similar types of methodologies. And the interesting thing is from the point of view of the attention that we got in the media, even though food sovereignty and all of it, that sort of thing, ought to be of primary significance to a society. We only had a handful of requests from the media for interviews, whereas when we did 3 years of work on the adaptation of the ski and golf industries to climate change across Quebec, we were inundated by calls from the media for interviews and what have you. So on that basis, leisure activities for the average Quebecois seem to be much more important than food production potential. And then I've also, in the last almost 4 years now, been involved as a co-researcher on a project involving looking at the resilience of coastal communities to sea level rise, and also climate variability, extreme climatic conditions. And we've had quite a few of them in the last just few years on our coasts. So the research that we've done involves not interdisciplinary teams, not just multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary people from agronomy, from sociology, from anthropology, from economics, and from geography, and climatology. They're multi-scalar in the sense that they go from the level of the province to the region, so we do downscaling of climate scenarios, and we link that to DSAT yield generating models for different crops in different regions. And we go down to the local level to talk to farmers, both in focus groups as well as interviews. And we also use the farmers interested in enough to actually comment on the parameters that we use to link the climate scenarios to the yield generations. And we've frequently had to change the parameters to integrate local circumstances, which are not found in the overall sort of manuals where we get these parameters from. And multi-analytical. Okay, what we're interested, the last two projects is increasingly being involved co-construction, particularly in terms of how do you build better capacity in agriculture to deal with climate change and variability. And by co-construction, I mean that basically you get the farmers involved, you get the neighbors involved, you get other professional associations involved, community organizations, NGOs, and at least regional representatives of provincial governments. It's not easy to get the principal ministry involved, and also the Financial Agricultural Corporation of Quebec, which has provided us with probably tens and tens of thousands of dollars worth of data for over 30 years on farmer claims under crop insurance programs, why they made their claims, and I think it's a unique set of data in the world. I haven't yet come across anything quite like it. And they gave it to us, did all the work for us, simply because they're bothered by their bottom line. Every time there's a big storm or climatic extremes, farmers end up putting in claims. And 12 years ago, 75% of the claims in 1 year were made by grain corn producers, which are one of the sort of almost have become one of the emblematic productions, agricultural productions of the province, because they had a terrible season. They had dry spells, a drought when you didn't need drought. You had excess rainfall when you didn't need excess rainfall. I mean, they got everything in the neck. And okay, so our aim is to try and get all these players together to start thinking about working together to develop appropriate programs. This is what's called action research. That is to say, you work on the ground with people, I think as you pointed out earlier, to try and see whether they can develop their own way of doing things. It's not the experts' way of doing things, because that's probably not going to be correct. Okay, and what's important is to understand the perceptions of the actors and how they make decisions. You just don't pull people together. You need to understand how they react to things, what makes them tick. So in many cases, we're dealing with every actor, doesn't matter what domain. There are multiple stresses that affect their decision-making environment, even in government, civil servant. We don't know all of those stresses, but it can be personal, family, they're legitimate concerns, but they may not be compatible with what the person happens to be doing in public office, for instance. Okay, so we're not even dealing with the same priorities, even for the same type of actor. Farmers in different communities, in different regions, not just in Quebec, but all over, do not necessarily have the same priorities. So how can you get a government to put out a program to deal with agriculture, and they're treating farmers as if they were all the same? Because they're not. Okay, so we have, and this was mentioned, I think, as well by you. Okay, and so all of these points have major implications for public policy and program development aimed at building capacity. Okay, let me go through this very quickly. Okay, we started off by doing a lot of, I don't know why I got tens in there, climate scenarios, what comes of doing things late at night. Climate scenarios, historical data to start with, interviews with farmers, focus groups or workshops with farmers and other professionals, and then towards the end of the 90s and since then, all of that, plus we've been using the crop insurance program data, as well as economic modeling at the level of the farm. And one of the things that the crop insurance program data gave us, it gave us the opportunity to show farmers what they had actually experienced over 12 years, 20 years, and in some cultures for 30 years. And it suddenly brought things home to roost, literally, okay, if you understand the English here. Because all of a sudden, we're not talking just about climate change, because there's always some skepticism, even now, but we're talking about variability. That's what makes it, that's what's difficult for farmers. They'll tell us, they told us, okay, well, if you're talking about this situation once in 10 years, no problem. We do that already. But if you start saying it's once in 5 years, or once in 3 years, well, then it changes the whole ballgame. So then we have to adapt. We have to do something different. Okay, as I just said, farmers initially, when we started talking to them, particularly in the sort of the more prosperous agricultural areas, they didn't really care much about climate change, but we managed to mobilize them and get them to come together in workshops where we talked to them, let them talk to us. However, once they saw what might be happening, their first question, even with very little analysis, not much detailed analysis, was, okay, well that's interesting, but what will happen to the farmers in the Middle West in the States, or the prairies, with whom they compete? Their only priority, the main priority, was money, profit, and how they were going to come out of this as in a sort of competitive global environment. Many of them still see climate change, even though it's changed, as secondary compared with other stresses. But a lot of the things that they're doing, like going back into diversification, better water management, these sorts of things, they're doing them for reasons not just linked to climate change, but for other stresses. To maintain their income, to reduce variability of income, to be better farmers. Now, as some people told us, we also did some work in Ontario, say, well, you know, if you're telling us this is the way it's going to happen, and we want to know that, And we're going to do something about it, because the last thing we want is a bunch of incompetent agricultural ministry representatives coming and telling us what to do, when frequently they can't tell the difference between one territory and another in terms of their biophysical environment. Okay, and so I already mentioned this. What we've been focusing on now is the co-construction of public intervention. The risk management strategies, again, to start off with, everybody thought that they had all that it took to deal with climate variability, until they started seeing the fact that there was an increase in the frequency of extreme conditions. Okay? And we've had that happening at the end of the 90s and into the 21st century. Okay, and at that time, other preoccupations dominated, and this is why I said earlier on, it's extremely important for people to understand the decision-making environment of these people, of the farms, as well as the other players. So here are the risk management strategies that they've been getting into. Water management. In fact, our last project focuses initially on water management strategies. Choice of crops and cultivars, diversification. Crop insurance actually becomes a choice, because it's not required. They chose to do it or not. And frequently in the best agricultural areas, they don't choose to get involved. A lot of them don't choose to get involved, because they figure they can still handle it themselves. And in the poorer agricultural areas, like in Second Lac Saint-Jean, they characteristically buy into the crop insurance program, but what we found when we do the modeling at the farm level, when you buy into an insurance program, it actually leads to maladaptation. It stops you from adapting. The only thing that will start them adapting again is when the financial agricultural corporation starts saying, all right, well, we're not going to insure crops A, B, and C in this region. Okay, and they've done that. Just as they've opened up insuring crops in other regions, because they think with climate change it might actually become better in those areas. Okay, and all of this, you have to recognize that there's significant variation between territories and communities. And I'm going to show you very quickly, I think, some diagrams. Not quite yet. Okay. I'll skip that one. And this one is just to show that when we look at this is in terms of territorial planning. We do it by identifying, firstly, strategic orientations. And here we've got 3 sectoral orientations that we've been chosen by people for one area: tourism development, industry, agriculture. There's some overlap. And along here are the interests, the legitimate interests involved in those different orientations. At the top of the agricultural one, you've got farmers. But there are a lot more people that are interested in farming and what happens to farmland than just the farmers. Farming, as you know, in Europe, supports, and we recognize that now finally in Quebec and other parts of Canada, supports a whole range of other functions for society that are very valuable. That's why we talk about multifunctional, you talk about multifunctionality. Okay, so we did get down here, and there's a lot more people involved. If I go into a room, which I did once, I've been asked to go in and talk to people about the forest industry problems in an area and how they would resolve them. When I walked into the room, I thought, oh my goodness, there isn't a single person here who represents anything else other than the forest industry and the local government. But how can they find a solution all on their own? And sometimes you need people from outside to be able to take an unbiased look, because many of the people in the room have contributed to the problem. Okay, social development is a bit different. It's not as clear as I intended to be. It's a thematic or transversal orientation. It cuts across everything, and so does climate change and variability. It's something that affects everybody. It's something that affects every type of other activity, sexual activity, or other type of thing. And this is why it doesn't mean that you need to try to get everybody into the room at the same time, but you need to be able to pull together, mobilize the people who represent the different legitimate interests across the whole community. Okay, challenges. Oops. Okay, one of the biggest challenges for government is how do they integrate other actors into their thinking and how they do things. In order to do it, because I believe that doing that is essential somehow, they need to know how the other players make their decisions, how they choose different strategies. They need to be able to recognize that other people can also take responsibility, that government doesn't have to do everything, and in fact it can't do most things because it doesn't have a presence on the ground. I mean, most ministries of agriculture in North America particularly in Canada, have wiped out most of the direct representation of the Ministry of Agriculture on the ground in the regions. And nobody trusts, I'm exaggerating obviously, people don't generally trust the people who sit in an office in Quebec City to tell them how to farm. Okay. I can understand that. Okay, so governments have to recognize responsibility, the capability of taking responsibility in other actors, and to help other players reinforce their own adaptive capacities. So they can, in fact, stand in for government. Okay, and as I said, this means that they have to recognize that they can't do a lot of the things on the ground. Okay, I've said that, so that's fine. They have to be able to take into account these regional or territorial or provincial specificities, and that means also, at a supranational level, the differences between countries. You can have one program, but if the program has something particular that it's trying to sell, then forget it. It has to be supple enough to be able, flexible enough, that is, to be able to deal with and accommodate all of these differences. And we've started hearing this on several occasions today. Okay. And not only are there multiple players, multiple actors, one is a collective actor, you have a representative of that collective actor frequently. Never forget that even though the representative of a collective actor is supposed to represent some sort of collective organizational objective, that in reality they frequently do not. And that's why some of the weirdest, strangest decisions end up being taken because they're doing something to protect their own professional and field of competence. I've come across that in France, in rural areas, so I mean, it's not unique to Canada by any means. I've come across it so many times, it's just not funny. It means that you just have to spend time when you first go to a community or territory to really try and understand who's doing what to who and why they're doing it. Okay, because some of these other interests can get in the way of doing their public job correctly. And you may be lucky coming from regions where that doesn't happen. But I'd be prepared to take a bet that it definitely does. Okay, this is some realities very quickly, and then that's where I'm finished. This is one I only had it in French to start with. This is all from the data from the Agricultural Financial Corporation. The client payments, the mauve, the blue, the dark blue, and you can see the client payments, the farmer payments into the program, crop insurance program. It's fairly stable. Went up a little bit here, just a year after there was a major set of claims because of major climatic extremes. This is a loss index. It's the value of indemnities paid out divided by the dollar assured value by the farmers that were participating in the program. And you can see generally there are extremes, okay, and they've been extremes over a long time. The different regions, the 3 regions and the whole of Quebec identified here, follow more or less the same pattern. But the better regions, like southwest of Montreal, the darker blue up here, basically tends to have a fairly some fluctuation, sometimes a bit larger, but it fluctuates. But it's not so bad most of the time that it can't be accommodated. This is just rainfall yields based on the claims made by farmers over that period of about 13 years. And again, you see all the different regions follow the same general pattern, but there are differences. And when things get bad, the worst regions like Mauricie here do really bad. And probably some of those regions should never have had grain corn production in any case. So those would be some of the regions that the Agricultural Financial Corporation would be looking at to see whether they should stop insuring such and such a crop in that particular, or the grain corn in that particular region. And this is the 3 other regions that we looked at. Central Quebec, this is the best agricultural region. It's again with the grain corn loss index in that year, which was just a terrible year for grain corn producers. But actually, even here, it wasn't too bad. But even there, you can see some variation over relatively short distances. Here, much larger variations, because the climate conditions, climatic conditions, local climatic conditions, vary enormously in that particular territory. And similarly in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, although there weren't very many municipalities with farmers that actually insure themselves. So we're talking about realities. Here's two totally, I've got hundreds of pictures of farming areas from around the world, but I just picked 2 from one because it's near Paris, which is where I've done a lot of my research. On the plateau just south of Paris, large-scale arable agriculture. And here is the little village in South Africa, Okombe, suffering from desertification, probably climate change, and certainly poor husbandry practices, as well as AIDS in the male population that would leave the community to work in Johannesburg and Durban and then come back affected. So these differences, just some examples. Examples of some of the things that we've been talking about. Decision makers' motives. Well, income, but they can vary from generating a satisfactory level of income to maximization, as far as you can get. But family considerations. In fact, in the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, we also did. I forgot to put that on. I also bought a special software package from somewhere in the States, which was a decision-making, analytical, hierarchical process, a decision-making system, and we did interviews with farmers in different regions in terms of what their priorities were. And the priorities of people in the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean region weren't making money. They were trying to make sure that there was a son or daughter going to take over the farm. In the best agricultural areas, their main priority was, how can I make more money? I mean, there'll be a whole range of about a dozen different priorities for each group, but they were in a different order. Okay, some are concerned with technological change and costs of adaptation. Okay, poverty reduction, that relates to the fact that there are some agricultural areas where, even in Quebec, where farmers are not particularly well off. Community consideration. Farmers don't always do what's best for them if they don't want to upset their relationship with the surrounding community. And I've encountered that in Quebec, in Ontario, and in the Paris region. Okay, farmers' motives. Okay, I just mentioned that. Government agencies. Oh my goodness, the Ministry of Agriculture for Quebec. It was very interested for a long time in competitiveness. And from the late 60s until, I'd say the late 90s, its main focus was making Quebec agriculture more and more competitive. That means more and more productivist, or more and more capitalistic. And they succeeded, except at the same time, like frequently happens with government, they solve one problem that they see as a problem, and they end up creating a bunch of others. Huge indebtedness, because it happened over a very short period of time, compared with what happened in other parts of Canada, where that movement started back in the late 40s, even in the 30s, actually. Okay, anyway, they're still interested in competitiveness. So they've been putting aside, in when they started thinking of programs to help agriculture, not just in climate change adaptation, but in generally, putting aside Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, because it's not seen as central to Quebec agricultural production. Now, in 20, 30 years' time, it could be. Okay? They're concerned with hard technology. When you talk to them about innovation, I mean, most of them have never heard of all of the diffusion of innovation work that was done in Sweden back in the 1950s, which had an impact on our marketing, companies involved in marketing services and inputs to farmers in North America. I mean, it's major. And yet, and it's not just hard technology, it's soft technology. It's ideas. Soft technology like strategies, which doesn't necessarily require a lot of money. What's happening, though, is that this is beginning to change just in the last 4 or 5 years, because some of the people in the civil service are retiring and others are coming in, and there are some younger people coming in, and they've gone through their formation training at a more recent time when a lot of these other preoccupations are being talked about. Well, that's very interesting, I find. Okay, and other organizations, well, you have to realize it. If government finances you, you start paying attention to what government's needs are, as interpreted by their representatives. So you can waste an awful lot of money that you get from government doing things and massaging things to make it look as though you've done okay so that you can get another installment. I mean, it happens in rural areas, it happens in urban areas, in the community development corporations, for instance. So you just have to understand how people make decisions. Conclusions. First, how do we incorporate into, say, any type of public program, public intervention program, collective intervention program, the important geographic and temporal variations in extreme climate conditions? Well, I would say the one way to do it is not to have government operationalize it on the ground, is to have other players, other actors do it. People who have some confidence, in whom the farmers have confidence. But I could say the same thing, I believe, for almost any other sort of dimension of our society. Okay, you don't spend money to build capacity. Now that's an extreme because everybody loves money, right? But just spending money it can be such a wasteful thing, as we know. We've thrown away dollars in the last 40 or 50 years on stupid development projects or inappropriate development projects. You need to know what you're spending it on and how you're going to use it in order to build capacity, and that's another reason for using other players or actors closer to the ground, because their knowledge is so much better. They need to be able to mobilize legitimate actors and get them involved to have effective governance. Once when I said that to a bunch of my graduate students, I had several African students, and one of them said, "You couldn't do that." I won't tell you what country she came from. She said, "If you only dealt with legitimate actors, then how do we get anything done? Because a lot of them have illegitimate interests." Okay, so you have to compose with it, you have to deal with it. It's very difficult for government, certainly the governments, I mean, maybe it's not like this in the rest of the world, particularly in Canada, to recognize that in order to be effective, they have to deal with other people and involve other people. I've even met somebody who was the president of a regional association in France, who said basically, well, if the central government doesn't involve us in constructing policy that affects us, we're not going to play. We're not interested. That was in Alsace-Lorraine. We're not interested. We have to be involved. We don't want policy coming out that's being developed secretly by a select group of people, like it used to be. We need to have a share in, or say in what happens. Okay. And that basically requires the government to recognize that lots of people have other things that they can offer. Creativity, local knowledge, taking responsibility. And so this is one of the things that I think is a conclusion. But it's not just in climate change and adaptation capacity. It's also in economic development, local economic development, community development. Certainly government has a role, but not a sort of, reglementary role. That might be important for some things. Okay, but if they want to wipe out corruption down below, they have to wipe it out above as well. Emerging roles, and this has been happening over the last 15 years in a number of countries. Accompany players, actors on the ground, counseling them, informing them, animating or facilitating exchanges. Now, frequently government isn't in a position to do that, not upper levels of government. So they, again, have to work with actors on the ground in order to do it. When I go to mobilize 15, 20 farmers for a workshop, I certainly won't go to the Ministry of Agriculture or even the Financial Agricultural Corporation, even though they're generally regarded being very good. I'll go to something called a club conseil in most regions, a local regional club of farmers where people join voluntarily and pay now to hire somebody, a resource person, to counsel them on different types of strategies. It might be marketing, it might be environment, it might be all sorts of things. Okay, and so all of these things require government to know how to let go. Because I have a dicton. If you want to control development, lose it. Si vous voulez contrôler le développement, perdre le contrôle. It doesn't actually mean you forget about it. It means that you recognize that other people are important in terms of what you want to do. And it means that government still plays an important role. Okay, but it's a role that so many people in government, politicians included, seem to be very uncomfortable with. Not everybody, I know some fantastic people, but frequently they're successful because they do things outside of the parameters of what their ministries allow them to do. But they're successful because they don't do what the ministries tell them to do in terms of how they behave and how they deal with people and sort of thing. Anyway, I think that's it today. Okay, thank you.
Maybe you have some questions. Probably, I know what you're working on because we're working together in some subjects, but I wasn't here, so I just some questions maybe. Oh yeah.
Pierre from this university. Very good talk, therefore, on how you plan adaptation. Now, allow adaptation.
To encourage adaptation.
Encourage, very well. This activity, adaptation, is really the main game in town, as you can say. It's what our life is about. But one can say it's a little bit passive. Well, in a certain sense, it's passive. It's after you adapt to a certain challenge. And isn't the main game here is that we want to have less climate change or eventually variability, and therefore we have to kind of have the kind of adaptation or plan that adaptation where you have less. And so you gave us a long description very well to get all these different actors involved and to show that they have different aims or situations. But then, as I think you see my point, is that we have to adapt the actions to have less, well, in this case, climate change.
Yeah, I agree that this is why I said that mitigation is also involves adaptation, people changing, people in corporations, energy production, governments again. It's part of the same pattern, so to speak, and I understand from my climatologist colleagues that even if you stopped greenhouse gas emissions, you're still going to get changes because some of the things you can't go back on. In some environments, it's too far gone. It's not just because of climate change. It might be desertification as well in Africa. Poor husbandry, they just let things go too long. But the other thing is that adaptation is not simply reaction. You can have proactive adaptation. Okay? And that adaptation occurs, that type of adaptation occurs in say, within agriculture. It can happen with it in relation to climate change. But oftentimes what we found when people were, when farmers were talking about the sorts of issues or impacts that we associate with climate change, they're also taking to engage in strategies to address other issues. Some of it is competition. Some of it's to reduce their vulnerability to changes in international markets. So, again, we went through several decades of specialization in the larger farms, and now we're starting to go back to diversification, which is interesting. We also have adaptation, nothing to do directly with climate change or even indirectly, in farming around big cities. Okay, with people adapting to the urban market in different ways, and that requires its proactive adaptation. Okay, but again, not everybody does it, because there's one farmer told me next to Paris, just on the edge of the plain of inside, well, I'm certainly not going to do what my colleagues in the Ferme de Galie do, also partly on the Château de Versailles land. He said, I'm not a grocery store owner. Mind you, the Ferme de Galie seems to be incredibly successful in what they do. So some of the things that make people tick, drive them, can be very different, even within the same community. So that guy there, that farmer, I think he managed when I last saw him about 308 hectares of land with one worker. He said, that's all I need. I can take my vacations in the south, grande culture. I make my investments. I buy apartment buildings in Paris. You could at the time with the guaranteed prices that the European Union gave everybody. So, and yet the other he probably makes as much money as maybe some of the other much more intensive operations, which involves them in a lot more work. But at any rate, that's their choice. It's something that they want to do. Okay. So, but the point is well taken. That's why I put in mitigation also requires adaptation. And just because somebody says, oh, the corporations are involved in discussions, I don't mean to say, even if they sign something, it does not mean to say that they do it. In fact, one of the caricatures I almost put up was two people coming out of a meeting where they had signed an agreement. And the guy saying to the woman, well, I signed this stupid thing, but I'm not going to play their game. You know, they signed it just to get out and have a beer. Yeah.
My question may not be very different from the preceding one, but what I would like to understand is, and in a more provocative way, what do you expect as practical result from the lot of information that you have in your conclusion, in your studies? What can you expect from that? Or, in other words, what is your main audience? Is it the public authorities, or is it more
it's actually everybody,
or the association?
It's the general public was more interested, as I said at the beginning, in skiing and golfing. Okay, I wasn't particularly interested in food production. Some people are very much interested. But the main is the farmers to start with. And one of the things that we tried to do was to find a way of communicating research to them, which they also became involved in influencing, so that they would appropriate the idea that, yes, climate change and variability is real. Because a few years beforehand, to them it was sort of interesting, curious, but nothing that they needed to pay any attention to. Now they started paying. Now they are really paying attention to it. Even the Ministry of Agriculture is now paying attention to it, but not necessarily in the right way, according to me. But that's another matter. The other thing is to get people more to the general public, more appreciative of the fact that the farming, particularly the farming resources around not just Montreal but most large cities in North America are in the best agricultural resource areas in terms of land. There are only two communities, two provinces I should say, in Canada that have land protection programs, agricultural land protection programs. One was in British Columbia that started in 1972, and it based its work on a lot of the American states that introduced land protection programs for agriculture during the 1960s of different types. And then Quebec was the second one that introduced land protection program in the 1970s. It basically took a lot of what was in the BC program and transferred it. That was because, for one reason or another, political or simply because of scarce resources, they decided that they had to protect the production potential of the best farm resources. As it happens, that was way before the climate change and variability became on the agenda. But it gives an additional weight to wanting to conserve. I'll let me use the word conserve instead of protect. Conserve those agricultural resources, because not only, if things keep on going the way they are, not only will they be called upon to play a greater role in feeding the local urban population, and several million people, but they'll also be called upon probably to feed other countries which already do not have the capability of meeting their food needs. And you have Ontario 3 years ago. It's not a food land. It's not a protection program per se. They did introduce in '78 food land guidelines for municipalities and regions to show them how they could actually use their own planning apparatus to conserve agricultural land. But now, since 2008, Ontario has called the Toronto Green Belt, but in fact it's huge. It's the largest green belt in the world that goes all the way around the western end of Lake Ontario. And it's mostly very good agricultural land. But that's only one reason. I mean, they realized as well that they were, in terms of sustainability, they always usually use that terminology, that otherwise people would keep moving out into the countryside and increasing the need to invest in infrastructure, road infrastructure, and then of course there was the business of taking away on that. But all of this land also has a major recreation and leisure activity function as well. We also incidentally have the largest publicly owned green belt in the world. I think it's the largest. It's around Ottawa, the South Ottawa, which has 9,000 hectares of land. But it shows that the government is not a very good manager of land, because there is less land used for agriculture now than there was 50 years ago.
Well, there's two questions, and then we will end because while we have some champagne, and it's getting warmer and warmer. So two questions. First one's here, another one.
En français, si vous permettez. Oui. Vous avez défendu l'idée que l'acteur public doit se mettre dans une position faible pour produire des évolutions, si j'ai bien compris.
Non, c'est pas une position faible. C'est-à-dire une position plus forte qu'actuellement, parce que s'il ne change pas, il va perdre sa capacité un impact. Parce qu'on ne peut pas tout réglementer. On ne peut pas réglementer la capacité d'adaptation. On ne peut pas réglementer l'accès à différents marchés. Donc il y a un tas de choses que le gouvernement ne peut pas faire. Le rôle d'accompagnement, d'informateur, de conseiller et d'animateur, ce sont des rôles qui sont maintenant considérés pas uniquement en agriculture, mais par rapport au développement local et communautaire, comme étant les rôles les plus importants pour un gouvernement central. Parce qu'il ne peut pas faire le travail de terrain que d'autres acteurs peuvent faire. Par contre, il peut travailler avec ces autres acteurs. Et ça va bien. Du moment qu'il y a du respect mutuel entre le gouvernement et les acteurs, ça peut très bien marcher. Et donc, c'est pas de les mettre dans une position moins forte, c'est en termes de s'adapter aux conditions changeantes de nos sociétés. C'est déjà en cours, certainement dans la plupart des provinces du Canada, c'est encore en Australie, en Nouvelle-Zélande, dans plusieurs d'autres pays que j'ai exploré avec le développement du Canada. Parce que justement, quand le gouvernement essaie de mettre sa main lourde sur tout ce qui se passe, ça ne marche pas. Ça coûte une fortune, c'est pas efficace, et donc on a besoin de ces autres acteurs. C'est pas une question de perdre la puissance, c'est le contraire, c'est de renforcer, valoriser ces rôles dans les transformations de nos sociétés. La plupart de la réglementation, il y a tellement de règlements sur ce qu'on appelle sur les books, sur les livres, qui ne fonctionnent pas, parce qu'il n'y a pas de moyen de les mettre en application. Mais par contre, en travaillant avec d'autres acteurs sur le terrain, il y a beaucoup de choses qu'on peut faire pour aider les agriculteurs, pour les conseiller. Mais souvent en utilisant d'autres acteurs.
Merci. Since everybody seems to speak French now, I shall be lazy as well. Et je continue en français. Oui, on pourra recommencer en anglais tout à l'heure, mais ce qui m'a beaucoup intéressé, mais un peu surpris, c'est tout de même essentiellement dans les aires périurbaines, l'agriculture autour des grandes agglomérations canadiennes. Et ça me paraît très différent des situations observées tant dans notre pays que dans beaucoup de pays du bassin méditerranéen, où l'objectif, la lutte est très inégale entre une agriculture périurbaine et l'expansion urbaine qui balaye implacablement ces agricultures périurbaines et qui, dans certains cas, je vois dans une partie de l'Italie ou bien en Turquie, justement les terres, et vous l'avez souligné, les très bonnes terres agricoles juste autour des grandes villes, dans des étendues de plaines pas très nombreuses, mais sont malgré tout mangées par la croissance et éventuellement la spéculation immobilière. Et on rejette à ce moment-là des terres agricoles beaucoup plus loin, dans des terres beaucoup moins favorables, sur des sols plus difficiles, qui vont enchaîner de l'érosion.
Non, justement, ça a été une préoccupation nord-américaine dans beaucoup de juridictions, même si pas toutes les juridictions ont adopté une loi de protection du territoire agricole. En Ontario, ils ne l'ont pas fait parce qu'à l'époque, dans les années 70, 80, c'était politiquement pas acceptable pour le gouvernement d'intervenir directement sur le terrain comme ça. C'était C'était simplement
Oui,
une
mais
question
alors,
d'élection.
Non, mais si justement ils arrivaient à résister sans intervention du gouvernement,
Non, parce
c'est qu'ils
qu'ils
étaient
ont donné,
extrêmement forts,
ils ont donné, en Ontario, ils ont donné des conseils
Ouais.
aux
Oui.
municipalités et
D'accord.
les meilleurs,
Ouais.
c'est pas nécessairement des modèles,
Ouais.
mais il y en a plusieurs qui ont adopté ces conseils, ces consignes très très rapidement. Et aujourd'hui, on peut passer autour de ces agglomérations de grande taille ou de taille moyenne, et il y a très peu d'étalement urbain. Mais l'étalement urbain en soi n'est pas nécessairement un problème non plus. Non, mais je veux ça.
Moi, je suis étonné du fait que les agriculteurs résistent à la tentation.
Non, mais
vous avez dit tout le monde tout de même aime bien se faire un petit peu d'argent au passage. Hein, et là, on s'en fait pas un peu, on s'en fait beaucoup. En cédant le territoire à l'urbanisation.
Juste un petit commentaire par rapport à l'agriculture urbaine, c'est qu'un de mes projets impliquait, avait comme objectif la réduction de la vulnérabilité des territoires agricoles périurbains autour de Montréal.
Oui.
Ok. Donc on avait commencé, mais par un processus de recherche-action.
Oui.
Et donc j'ai une étudiante graduée qui s'est occupée de 2 projets. Et puis un troisième, c'était le groupe d'agriculteurs qui sont venus me voir, où ils ont envoyé un stagiaire me voir pour me demander, nous, on aimerait bien pérenniser notre agriculture, pourriez-vous nous aider? Est-ce qu'on peut venir vous rendre visite à Montréal? Et j'ai dit, ah non. J'irai vous chercher, j'irai vous voir, j'irai vous voir sur vos fermes. J'irai vous voir sur vos fermes. Et après, ils m'ont dit, c'était juste un tout petit groupe de 3 agriculteurs. Et puis, ils m'ont demandé, est-ce que si on cherchait l'appui de d'autres acteurs, ça pourrait aider notre affaire? Et je leur ai dit, bah oui, et on pourrait vous donner un coup de main si vous voulez. Mais si vous faites ça, il faut le faire en toute connaissance de cause, que c'est très probable que votre projet initial va être modifié dès que vous impliquez d'autres acteurs. Donc, j'avais une stagiaire française de Montpellier, un agronome à l'époque, et eux, les agriculteurs, avaient un stagiaire américain avocat en formation avec eux, et donc les 2 filles se sont mises ensemble et elles sont allées rencontrer des acteurs face à face. Et quand j'étais de retour d'une période de mon propre terrain en France, 2 jours plus tard, on avait prévu l'organisation d'une journée de réflexion pour ce petit territoire de peut-être 70 hectares, quelque chose comme ça, pas beaucoup. Mais sur une municipalité énorme avec seulement 1000 personnes sur l'île de Montréal. Et cette journée de réflexion, dès que j'arrive chez moi, je reçois un coup de fil et Monsieur Bryant, on a un problème. L'écomusée où on allait organiser la discussion n'est pas assez grand. On a 80 à 100 personnes maintenant. Et donc ces deux jeunes femmes avaient mobilisé une centaine de représentants d'environ 80 organismes. La Ville de Montréal, l'agglomération de Montréal, l'Union des producteurs agricoles du Québec, le MAPAC, toutes sortes d'organismes communautaires qui essayaient de rendre l'accès plus facile aux plus pauvres à une alimentation saine. Et puis tous ces agriculteurs, c'était des agriculteurs bio. Et puis ça continue aujourd'hui. Depuis 2 ans, ça dure. Même les propriétaires sont impliqués et les propriétaires ne veulent pas de développement résidentiel, ils ne veulent pas de parc industriel. Ils ont dit qu'ils veulent que ça reste vert. Et donc, à partir de 70 hectares, c'est en train de toucher non seulement toute la municipalité, qui est vert et boisée, pour la plupart, mais également ça contribue à une réflexion présentement sur organisé par l'Office de consultation publique de Montréal, suite à 29 000 signatures reçues avant Noël, sur l'agriculture urbaine et périurbaine dans la région de Montréal. Et il y a des risques que ça va devenir une ceinture de verdure dans les prochaines
Merci.
années.
Non, c'est pas une conversation à deux. Je voulais vous dire, cher Christopher, que je suis très admiratif sur cette évolution, parce que jusqu'ici, ne connaissant pas ce que vous faites au Canada, la seule terre agricole qui était susceptible de résister à l'urbanisation, c'était la vigne portant du champagne. C'est à peu près la seule où le terrain supporte. Et je crois que justement François allait nous inviter à quelques travaux pratiques.
Oui, alors on va essayer d'aller aux travaux pratiques très très rapidement, parce que il se trouve que Ignace Isaac doit nous quitter dans quelques minutes. Donc là, ça fait un petit peu de retard. Donc merci à tous. Il y a les champagnes qui nous attendent. Je vous rejoins dans 10 minutes parce qu'il faut que je voie quelqu'un avant. Merci.